Hi, it's Richard here from the OPA Hub website with the Introduction and Prerequisites chapter of our Siebel and OPA integration webinar. Let's look at the agenda. As an introduction chapter, we're going to be focusing on the big picture. Essentially, we'll remind ourselves of typical Siebel CRM integration architecture. We'll look at the OPA architecture as a whole, and then we'll focus on the integration architecture, so that we can begin to map typical Siebel CRM integration tools with whatever OPA has to offer. We'll also look at some functional integration and technical integration options. What do I mean? We'll look at typical things like the users say they want this. We'll look at that from a functional perspective, so we understand what it is the users want. And we'll also talk about the technical side. What can we use maybe in Siebel and in OPA to achieve that goal? In a sense, at the same time, you're going to be learning some OPA concepts. So if you're not that familiar with OPA, this will be a good start. And then at the end, we'll give you some prerequisites. If you want to do all the exercises that are coming up later that we've recorded for you, if you want to repeat them yourself, the kind of environment that you'll need. So because this is the first module, just a little stipulation. We don't assume any integration experience between Siebel and OPA. But we do assume a certain degree of experience with Siebel. We would like it if you are familiar with navigating in Siebel, and we would like it if you were familiar with Siebel tools, particularly if you're familiar with business components, integration objects, applets, and ideally business services. Clearly, key concepts such as what do I use Siebel for, or what is OPA, what is an expert system, we assume that you've done your homework beforehand, but we'll try and fill in with a lot of the buzzwords along the way. So before we begin, let's consider typical Siebel integration architecture, because not everything that we have in Siebel is going to help us with OPA, so it's good to kind of lay out what we have so that we can maybe exclude some of them. So this diagram is probably very familiar to a lot of you. The three layers, the green, the gray, the orange there on the left, representing three common ways to integrate with Siebel. I've kind of split it off into two parts, although I probably could have kept it in one picture. I think what you should think of is this, is the green layer is interaction with the database. So EIM, for example. The gray layer is typical business level integration. We use Siebel workflow processes, Siebel business services, integration objects, typically some kind of XML based stuff going on. In the user interface layer, we may also integrate in the user interface layer. We might have done it in the past with eScript or JavaScript. Now we're probably going to do it in the Siebel OpenUI API. Let's look at it now with OPA added into the mix. So where is OPA? What does OPA do? How do we work with it? So what you're looking at now on the right-hand side is the execution and administration engines of OPA. I've taken out of this picture the design time, the Oracle policy modeling, which is almost like the Siebel tools of the OPA world. It's where you do all your configuration. Let's assume that you've done something in OPA and you've deployed something in OPA. So you'll notice it says in the middle there, deployed OPA rule base. We don't deploy SRFs, which you guys do in Siebel. We deploy rule bases. We deploy rules. And applications like Siebel can come and ask us to execute the rules, and we'll give an answer. Notice that I also have, right at the top there, the OPA hub. Siebel, OPA also has an administrative interface. It has a web-based administrative tool called the OPA Hub, which we're going to use as part of our integration because that's where we have to do a lot of administrative tasks to ensure that Siebel and OPA connect. It is interesting to note that the OPA Hub has a REST API, so if you need to automate deployments or automate certain tasks in OPA, you can do it through a REST API. But most of the time in this course, we'll be focusing on the deployment of an OPA rule base and how we can then execute it from Siebel. Notice that we have two orange sections down there that say the OPA JavaScript API and the Siebel OpenUI API. Both of those are options when it comes to displaying something directly in Siebel, as we'll see later on. Now let's add some more detail to that by looking at the functional and technical integration options. So scenario number 1. User wants to be able to execute an Oracle Policy Automation questionnaire, or we call them interviews, but I've used questionnaire as a kind of generic term, from within Siebel. Notice that in this functional example, there is no relationship between the questionnaire and Siebel. It's a bit like saying I want to embed Google Maps in Siebel, but I don't want Google Maps and Siebel to talk. All I want to do is put Google Maps in Siebel so I can play around with the map. That in itself is an integration option. It's possible to embed a questionnaire in Siebel. It runs independently of Siebel. It has no relationship with Siebel, but we embed it in Siebel to make it easier for the user to do their daily job. The second, and obviously far more common integration option is, I want to see an interview which was written in OPA, but I want some of the questions to be answered with data from Siebel. So take a look at this URL here. Take a look at this interview you have here. What is the customer's first name? What is the customer's last name? It's a questionnaire. It's an interview. But the answers have come from Siebel. The data has been loaded into the questionnaire. I'm going to click Next, you can see in that picture, and I'm going to do more things in this interview. And at the end of the interview, I'm going to submit the data back to Siebel. Maybe there's going to be some calculations done. Maybe there's going to be some extra data that will be sent back to Siebel. So this is a very common one. The interview uses Siebel data. So we load Siebel data in and we submit Siebel data back at the end. So we could put it like this. The user wants to be able to execute a rule base from within Siebel using Siebel data to pre-seed the rule base and receive the output back into Siebel for subsequent processing. So let's go back through those two examples we gave you and think about how we might achieve them in Siebel. Let's take the first one, which is essentially display something in Siebel that is unrelated to Siebel and does not communicate with Siebel. It won't surprise you then that you can see symbolic URL, because you could embed this thing into Siebel with a symbolic URL. You could also embed it using using OpenUI JavaScript, because there's a JavaScript API for Oracle Policy Automation too. We could embed directly a JavaScript engine into an applet. The advantage of that would be that we won't be working with an iframe, whereas a symbolic URL is typically going to hit us with an iframe. And as we all know, iframes suck. Now let's think about the second example, where the interview actually loaded data in from Siebel. Maybe we answered a few of the questions with data from Siebel, and then we filled in some more, we did some calculations, and then we sent the whole thing back, or some of it back to Siebel. So this requires the OPA interview, the rule base, to be aware of the existence of Siebel data. But not just at runtime. It means that the person who designs the rule base in OPA needs to be able to stipulate that this rule base requires Siebel data, right down to we need to know which field and which business component. So in this case, in the previous example, it was maybe the employee first name and the employee last name. We need to be able to set that up when we're working in Oracle policy modeling at design time. The designer needs to know how to stipulate the data to be loaded. The designer also needs to know how to stipulate the data that will be sent back to Siebel, because it's not necessarily going to be the same data. Maybe we'll load the name and the first name, and then we'll send back, I don't know, your bonus amount into Siebel. So our Oracle Policy Automation rule base will do some calculations and calculate your bonus, and it's the bonus that will go back to Siebel. Notice the third point. It means that we have some restrictions. This is a request-response mechanism in a way. So when we execute the interview, we can load data. When we finish the interview, we can submit the data back to Siebel. But we can only do that once per interview session. Notice the hyphen at the end. It says, but reference data can be dynamically loaded. There's an exception to this rule, is that if you've already loaded some data, let's take the example of Siebel Administrator again. You've loaded the employee into the interview in OPA. Later in the interview, you want to retrieve, let's give you an example, all the products bought by that person. You can load reference data later on in the interview, but you can only load one integration object. One integration object can be submitted, but you're allowed to load unrelated data during the interview. This is quite new, so if I sound excited, it's because it only showed up in the November 2017 release of OPA, so we're kind of excited about it. The fourth point starts to highlight the fact that there are some things that we do in OPA that you're probably not expecting in Siebel. If I design an interview in OPA, I can design checkpoints. Let's give you an example. I design an interview that has 60 pages. Not that I ever would. After 30 pages, there's a checkpoint. The checkpoint is a kind of status save. I save the state of the interview. I save it somewhere. I'm going to need to save it into Siebel. But it's not saving a completed interview. I'm not submitting back the bonus. Maybe I don't know the bonus yet. The data is going to be stored in a very specific way. This may necessitate a new table in Siebel to store this temporary saved data. For those of you who are Siebel people, it's a bit like Task UI. When you have a possibility to pause a task, the data is stored in a special table. Then when you resume it, it comes back out again. Kind of the same, but different. So, still continuing with our example of a user wants to have an OPA interview that loads Siebel data at the beginning and sends Siebel data at the end. We call this preceding the OPA rule base. Notice the second point. This means that the Siebel application needs to be able to call the relevant OPA application, the OPA web service, and needs to make sure that when it calls OPA, it sends Siebel data, the Siebel administrator. So in a sense, we've got to prepare some data, send it to OPA, wait for the interview to finish, and then we'll receive the answer, which will probably include more data from Siebel. So you've probably guessed it. In that context, we're going to be using a web service, because Oracle Policy Automation, each time you deploy a new set of rules in OPA, you essentially create a new web service. So we're going to be able to call that, and we're going to be able to call it and pass a lot of data to OPA at the same time. Which means that you're probably going to do a lot of this in workflow processes, maybe even write some business services to help you along the way. So this one is typical Siebel CRM integration. So far, so good, I hope. And of course, this is the big picture, so we're going to see a lot of this in much more detail later on. There are some concepts in OPA, if you're not familiar with them, may cause you a few surprises when you start integrating with Siebel. Maybe you are going to calculate a bonus for Siebel Administrator, but because the person who did the interview didn't have all the information, Oracle Policy Automation will return responses such as unknown. We'll also return such responses as uncertain. Oracle Policy Automation is going to send us back information that we may need to then parse and deal with in Siebel. Secondly, the behavior of the OPA web service can be modified in the sense that maybe the OPA web service, you call it in the wrong way, and instead of getting the response of the bonus, you get a response of the bonus on a whole bunch of other things that you weren't expecting. So we'll see later on that the OPA web service has some elements to it that we're going to need to be aware of if we're processing the response from OPA in a business service. So the keywords there are, will I receive only values? Will I just get the bonus? Will I receive a decision report, which is an explanation of how the bonus was calculated, essentially? Or will some things be missing because the designer of the OPA web service has set things to be invisible or to be silent? At this stage, it doesn't really matter if these don't make much sense, but let's just say that the OPA web service has some surprises for us. Now, there's some interesting vocabulary here. This is OPA vocabulary, but what is refreshing is that after a while you realize that this is going to be very, very similar to what you do in Siebel every day. On the left-hand side, I have a thing called an entity. Entities you can think of as a business object, or actually, let's put it a different way. It's more like a structure of entities. It's closer to a business object. In every Oracle policy rule base, you have at least one entity. And if you only have one entity, it's called the global entity. So you can think of that as a root entity, a root component. You can also design lots of child entities. So if you think about it, this isn't not too far away from a Siebel business object where you have a primary business component and lots of child business components. We can have inferred entity in Oracle, which is a bit in Oracle Policy Automation, which is a bit like calculated entities. We infer they exist through code, through rules. Our entities can have fields. We don't call them fields, we call them attributes. Our entities can have links. We don't call them links, we call them relationships. And our entities must have names. These are names that you can think of as XML tags. It's important that when you build your rule base in OPA, you remember to add names because the names show up as XML tags. On the right-hand side there, I've got my attributes. So remember, an attribute is essentially a field. You can have calculated fields, inferred fields if you like. Mapped attributes, now this is where we talk about integration. Maybe you have an attribute called the first name and another attribute called the last name. These are mapped to Siebel fields, so they're called mapped attributes. What about the bonus I mentioned? The bonus is also mapped, but it's mapped outbound. It's going back to Siebel. So whenever you see a mapped attribute, it's either coming in or going out or both. Attribute types. We have field types in Siebel. We have attribute types in OPA. Date, time, Boolean, and so on. Attribute decision report settings. These are settings that will cause more or less information to be sent back to Siebel when we ask for it. Attribute validation rules. We will have validation rules in OPA to ensure that if I'm doing an interview, that I don't enter the wrong kind of data or that I don't make a mistake. If someone asks me what is Sadmin's age and I enter -5, well, I've probably got a validation rule in OPA to control that data, to control the response. Names, attributes have XML tags as well. So here it is, I've kind of put the two together. You've got, whoa, okay, I've got an entity which is kind of like a business component. I've got the global entity, which is like a parent business component. I've got the child. So yeah, you can see where we're going. There's a bit of a mapping here with a business object and business component. So hopefully things are maybe a little bit more confused, but at least you feel like you've got a grip maybe on the tools that you're going to use. You're going to use business services, you're going to use workflows, but you don't really know how yet. If you're going to follow along step by step with all of the exercises that we show you in the 6 or 7 modules that are coming up, you will need a minimum of an Oracle Policy Automation with WebLogic Server. Typically, this will be a VM. In our demonstration, we're using Windows 2008 R2. You will also need, therefore, everything that makes OPA work, so the MySQL Server and Workbench, WebLogic 12c, and you will have installed the Oracle Policy Automation Server components. And you'll need Siebel as well, and you'll need a proper server application, a server installation with the EAI Object Manager ready to go, which means it's going to be a pretty chunky virtual machine. But these days, we're quite used to building those sort of things. Ideally, the Siebel environment will be on the same virtual machine, or it could be on another. They need to be accessible to each other, obviously, across a network. You need an EAI Object Manager and available for use because your OPA connection is, in the first instance, going to work with it. Depending on which version of Siebel you're using, you'll probably need to unzip and install a bunch of stuff. We will talk about that in detail later on. This course focuses almost exclusively on Siebel 16 because it's the one that's has the widest distribution in the wild. We do talk about Siebel CRM 15.5 because there is an integration with OPA, but it works in a very different way. But we do take the time to tell you how it works if you care to go and investigate it. So if you're going to install the OPA server applications, you will need WebLogic, which is cool because there's a really easy developer-grade WebLogic install you can do, which is essentially run a Java file, executable, and boom, WebLogic is installed. MySQL can be used for OPA as well. It's important for you to realize that MySQL is not used to store any data in terms of Siebel Administrator, the bonuses, or anything like that. It uses a MySQL database for information about connectivity to Siebel, information about permissions, who can use that connectivity. So it's purely an admin database. It's not storing any of your Siebel data. You will also need to install the OPA engines, so the engine that will generate the interview in HTML or the engine that will handle the request from Siebel. The process is very straightforward, but of course that implies that you've already installed WebLogic. You'll need to test connectivity to OPA, so you'll need to log into the hub, and you'll need to make sure that the hub is contactable through the typical URL. You'll need to log in, check the tabs, and if you're going to do this with the VM and then contact the VM from outside the VM, you'll most likely need to do some checking to make sure that the network card of the VM allows you to talk to outside of the VM. Finally, because in this class you're going to be working also in design time, you're going to install the modeling client, which is just a Windows-based application that needs Word and Excel. Sounds like a lot to implement just a training course, but chances are you probably have most of this already. I've got good news for you. If you need to build yourself an OPA environment for self-study, I've set out all of the steps through screenshots on the OPA Hub website. You can access that for free. It's in 3 parts. That's just the first. And I'm sure you know that on the Siebel Hub site, we already have lots of self-study guides on how to install Siebel. So it shouldn't be too difficult. I don't think anyway. So that's it for this initial chapter. We're going to just remind ourselves that you probably saw that the architecture, the typical integration pieces of Siebel are going to come in handy with some surprises. OPA has an architecture that runs on WebLogic and essentially is web service based for the most part, or HTML or XML based. OPA also uses a database, but purely for administrative purposes. So when you send Siebel data to OPA and it sends it back, it doesn't sit in a database anywhere. It's important for you to realize that this is just request response. We looked at some functional ideas, just embedding a web page or embedding a web page that actually loaded up data from Siebel. So those were the 2 key concepts. We'll talk obviously later on about how we can do more traditional integrations just using a web service. And we talked about the big concepts, the vocabulary, the entities, the attributes, and so on. So we're just about ready to get started building ourselves a Siebel and OPA integration.